The rotor blades were failing. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit like blood from a severed artery. The Black Hawk helicopter lurched violently to the left, its wounded frame groaning under the strain of carrying 47 Marines through the unforgiving Afghan sky. In the pilot's seat, Captain Sarah Chen's hands moved with surgical precision across controls that were rapidly becoming useless. Behind her, the voices of her fellow crew members carried a note she'd never heard before. Panic. "We're going down," shouted Staff Sergeant Rodriguez from the gunner's position. "All systems are failing." But Sarah Chen had been preparing for this moment her entire career, even if nobody else believed she could handle it. For months her male colleagues had whispered behind her back. Dead weight, they called her. Diversity higher. She'll crack under real pressure. Tonight, 30,000 feet above hostile territory, with the lives of nearly 50 Marines hanging in balance, Sarah would prove them all catastrophically wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of how one woman's unshakable determination and extraordinary skill turned what should have been a tragic military disaster into one of the most remarkable rescue operations in modern combat history. It's a story about prejudice, perseverance, and the kind of heroism that emerges when everything seems hopeless. But most importantly, it's about how the very person her unit considered their weakest link became their greatest salvation. Sarah Chen grew up in a small town in Oregon, the daughter of Taiwanese immigrants who had built a successful engineering firm from nothing. Her father, David Chen, had always taught her that excellence was not negotiable, that in a world where people would question her capabilities based on her gender and ethnicity, she would need to be twice as good to get half the recognition. Her mother, Linda, had survived the Cultural Revolution in China and carried within her a steely determination that she passed down to her daughter like a family heirloom. From childhood, Sarah had been fascinated by aviation. While other kids played with dolls or video games, she built model helicopters and devoured every book she could find about military aviation. Her bedroom walls were covered with posters of Apache helicopters, F-16 Fighting Falcons, and the mighty Black Hawk that would one day become her specialty. Her parents initially worried about her obsession with military aircraft, having fled countries where military power often meant oppression. But they recognized something special in their daughter's passion, a calling that went beyond mere interest. In high school, Sarah excelled in mathematics and physics, but her true talents emerged in the school's ROTC program. While her classmates struggled with the physical demands and mental pressure, Sarah thrived. She could disassemble and reassemble an M16 rifle faster than anyone in her class. She could navigate using only a compass and map while her peers got lost in familiar neighborhoods. But it was her natural ability to remain calm under pressure that truly set her apart. Her ROTC instructor, Master Sergeant William Hayes, of Vietnam, veteran with 3 tours under his belt, saw something in Sarah that reminded him of the best pilots he'd served with. "Chen," he told her one afternoon after she'd successfully completed a particularly challenging leadership exercise, "you've got ice water in your veins. That's not something you can teach." When Sarah announced her intention to join the Army and pursue helicopter aviation, the reactions were mixed. Her parents, while proud of her determination, worried about the dangers and discrimination she might face. Her classmates were skeptical. Aviation was still very much a man's world, and Asian women were virtually non-existent in combat roles. But Sarah had made up her mind. She would become a helicopter pilot, and she would be the best helicopter pilot the Army had ever seen. The path to flight school was grueling. Sarah had to score higher on every test, perform better in every simulation, and demonstrate more resilience than her male counterparts just to be taken seriously. At flight school in Fort Rucker, Alabama, She was one of only 3 women in a class of 47 candidates. The other 2 women washed out within the first month, unable to handle the combination of academic pressure, physical demands, and constant scrutiny. Sarah's flight instructor, Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Thompson, was a 20-year veteran who had initially been skeptical about training female pilots. He pushed Sarah harder than any other student, believing that if she was going to make it in a combat unit, she needed to be absolutely bulletproof. Chen, he would bark during particularly challenging flight exercises, "The enemy isn't going to go easy on you because you're a woman. Neither am I." The training was relentless. Sarah learned to fly in conditions that would terrify civilian pilots at night, in severe weather, with multiple system failures, while under simulated enemy fire. She mastered the art of flying with night vision goggles, navigating by instruments alone, and performing emergency landings in hostile territory. She learned to fly the UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter like it was an extension of her own body, understanding every vibration, every sound, every subtle change in performance that might indicate trouble. But technical skill was only part of the equation. Sarah also had to learn to work with crews who didn't necessarily want her there. The helicopter aviation community was tight-knit and tradition-bound, with informal networks and unspoken rules that often excluded outsiders. As a young Asian woman, Sarah was about as outside as it was possible to be. Upon graduation from flight school, Sarah Chen was assigned to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, also known as the Nightstalkers. This elite unit was responsible for inserting and extracting special operations forces in the most dangerous environments imaginable. It was an honor to be selected for such a prestigious assignment, but Sarah quickly discovered that not everyone in her new unit viewed her presence as an asset. The Nightstalkers had a reputation for being the best helicopter pilots in the world. They flew the most dangerous missions, often in complete darkness, into heavily defended enemy territory. The unit's motto, "Death waits in the dark," wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was a daily reality. For decades, this had been an exclusively male domain, where physical strength, aggressive flying, and an almost reckless courage were considered essential qualities. Sarah's first commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, was a decorated veteran of Operations Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom. He had served with distinction for over 2 decades and had genuine concerns about integrating women into Special Operations Aviation. During Sarah's initial interview, Morrison was blunt about his reservations. "Chun," he said, looking up from her personnel file, "your flight school scores are impressive. Top 5% in your class. But this isn't flight school. Out here, we're not grading you on how well you follow procedures. We're asking you to bring our people home alive from places where everyone is trying to kill them. Can you handle that kind of pressure?" Sarah's response was characteristic of her direct, no-nonsense approach. "Sir, I didn't come here to be coddled or to prove a point about gender integration. I came here to fly helicopters and save lives. Give me the chance to do both." Morrison assigned Sarah to Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, under the command of Captain Michael "Hawk" Davidson. Davidson was a 15-year veteran who had earned his nickname for his exceptional eyesight and ability to spot threats from incredible distances. He was also deeply skeptical about having a woman in his unit, particularly one who would be flying with his men into combat. Sarah's first crew assignment paired her with Staff Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez as her door gunner specialist, Jake Williams as her crew chief, and Corporal Marcus Johnson as her flight engineer. Rodriguez was a 10-year veteran from Texas who had served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Williams was a technical specialist from Detroit who could fix any mechanical problem with tools made from spare parts. Johnson was a quiet professional from North Carolina who had an almost supernatural ability to predict aircraft maintenance issues before they became problems. The initial meetings were awkward. Her crew members were professionally courteous but clearly uncomfortable. They had worked together for 2 years and had developed the kind of wordless communication that only comes from surviving dangerous situations together. Sarah represented an unknown variable in their carefully balanced equation. "Look, ma'am," Rodriguez said during their first crew meeting, "it's nothing personal, but we've got a system that works. We know each other's moves, we know how each other thinks." Adding, "Someone new to the mix, especially in our line of work, well, it's just going to take some adjustment." Sarah understood their concerns, but she also knew that she would have to prove herself through actions, not words. She threw herself into studying every aspect of special operations aviation. She memorized the technical specifications of every aircraft in the unit. She studied the terrain maps of Afghanistan and Iraq until she could navigate by memory. She practiced emergency procedures until they became second nature. But knowledge and skill were only part of the challenge. Sarah also had to overcome the informal social barriers that existed within the unit. The Nightstalkers had a strong culture of camaraderie built around shared experiences that Sarah, as a newcomer and a woman, couldn't immediately access. The after-mission debriefs often turned into informal bonding sessions, where war stories were shared and relationships were strengthened. Sarah found herself excluded from these gatherings, not through any formal policy, but through the subtle dynamics of male military culture. The breaking point came during her 3rd month with the unit. Sarah had been assigned to fly a routine training mission with her crew, practicing night insertions in mountainous terrain. The mission was designed to simulate the kind of operations they would perform in Afghanistan, flying at extremely low altitudes, using night vision goggles, landing in small clearings, surrounded by hostile forces. Everything was going smoothly until they encountered unexpected weather. A sudden storm system moved in, bringing with it severe winds and limited visibility. The training mission should have been aborted, but Davidson made the decision to continue, partly to test Sarah's performance under adverse conditions. As they approached the landing zone, the helicopter was caught in a severe downdraft. The Black Hawk dropped suddenly, its rotor blades coming dangerously close to the surrounding trees. Sarah's crew members braced for impact, certain that their young pilot would panic and crash the aircraft. Instead, Sarah's response was textbook perfect. She immediately adjusted the collective and cyclic controls, using the helicopter's momentum to slide sideways out of the downdraft. She increased power smoothly, avoiding the overcorrection that could have caused a fatal settling with power condition. Within seconds, she had regained control of the aircraft and was climbing back to a safe altitude. "Holy shit," whispered Johnson over the intercom. "Where did that come from?" Rodriguez, who had been preparing to take over the controls if Sarah panicked, slowly moved his hands away from his backup flight controls. "Nice flying, ma'am," he said, and for the first time, there was genuine respect in his voice. Word of Sarah's exceptional performance during the training emergency spread quickly through the Nightstalkers community. Aviation is a small world, and displays of skill under pressure are remembered and discussed for years. Captain Davidson, who had been skeptical about Sarah's abilities, found himself re-evaluating his initial assessment. "Chen," he said during their post-mission debrief, "that was some fine flying out there. You handled that downdraft better than pilots with twice your experience." But Sarah wasn't satisfied with grudging acceptance. She knew that in special operations, trust was earned through consistent performance over time, not through single moments of competence. She continued to push herself, volunteering for additional training, studying tactics and procedures, and working to build genuine relationships with her crew members. The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging night training exercise. Sarah and her crew were tasked with inserting a special forces team into a simulated enemy compound, waiting on station for 30 minutes while the team completed their mission, and then extracting them under simulated enemy fire. The exercise was designed to test not just flying skills, but crew coordination, communication, and decision-making under pressure. As they approached the insertion point, Sarah's crew chief Williams spotted what appeared to be enemy activity in the landing zone. "I've got movement at 2 o'clock, he reported. "Looks like 2, maybe 3 individuals with weapons." In reality, these were role players with blank ammunition, but the crew was supposed to treat the exercise as if it were real combat. Sarah had to make a decision: abort the mission and disappoint the Special Forces team, or continue with the insertion despite the apparent threat. "Rodriguez," she called to her door gunner, "can you suppress that position while we insert?" "Roger." "That, ma'am. I've got them covered." Sarah brought the helicopter in at a steep angle, using the aircraft's speed and the terrain to mask their approach. She landed hard and fast, getting the Special Forces team on the ground in less than 10 seconds before pulling up and away from the landing zone. The entire insertion was flawless, and the exercise controllers later praised it as one of the best they had ever observed. But it was during the extraction 30 minutes later that Sarah truly proved herself. As the Special Forces team approached the pickup point, they came under heavy simulated fire. Real pyrotechnics and blank ammunition created a chaotic, dangerous environment. Sarah had to land in a contested area, under fire, while her crew provided covering fire for the extraction. As Sarah brought the helicopter down, a simulated rocket-propelled grenade exploded nearby, and the exercise controllers threw a smoke grenade into the cockpit to simulate battle damage. Sarah couldn't see her instruments. Her crew was shouting conflicting information, and the Special Forces team was taking casualties from the role-playing enemy forces. Instead of panicking, Sarah relied on her training and her crew. "Johnson, I need you to talk me down. I can't see the instruments. Rodriguez, keep those guns talking. Williams, get ready to pull in the team the second we touch down." Flying blind, with smoke filling the cockpit and simulated gunfire all around her, Sarah brought the helicopter down smoothly. The Special Forces team was aboard in 15 seconds, and Sarah had them airborne and clear of the danger area in less than 30 seconds total. After the exercise, the Special Forces team leader, a grizzled master sergeant with 3 combat tours, approached Sarah with a handshake. "Ma'am," he said, "that was some of the best flying I've ever seen. If you ever want to transfer to the teams, you've got my recommendation." More importantly, Sarah noticed that her crew members were looking at her differently. The formal politeness had been replaced by genuine camaraderie. Rodriguez clapped her on the shoulder and said, "You know what, Chen? I think you might just work out after all." 6 months later, Sarah received orders for her first combat deployment. The 160th was being sent to Afghanistan to support Operation Enduring Freedom. The mission would involve flying Special Operations Forces into some of the most dangerous territory on Earth, often at night, always under the threat of enemy fire. Sarah's parents were terrified. Her father, David, tried to maintain his usual stoic demeanor, but her mother, Linda, broke down crying when Sarah told them about the deployment. "Why does it have to be you?" Linda asked. "Why can't someone else go?" Sarah's answer was simple and honest. "Because this is what I trained for, Mom. This is my job." The deployment to Afghanistan would test everything Sarah had learned about flying, about leadership, and about herself. The enemy was real, the stakes were life and death, and there would be no second chances for mistakes. Sarah knew that she would finally have the opportunity to prove that she belonged among the elite Nightstalkers, but she also knew that the cost of failure would be measured in the lives of the men who depended on her. As her unit prepared for deployment, Sarah spent her last few weeks in the United States with her crew, fine-tuning their procedures and building the kind of trust that would be essential for survival in combat. Rodriguez, Williams, and Johnson had become more than just crew members. They were her brothers, and she was determined to bring them home safely. The night before they left for Afghanistan, Sarah stood alone on the flight line, looking at the Black Hawk helicopter that would be her responsibility for the next year. She thought about all the people who had doubted her, all the challenges she had overcome, and all the missions that lay ahead. She didn't know that in just a few months, she would face the ultimate test of her skills and courage, or that the same colleagues who had once called her dead weight would owe their lives to her exceptional flying. But first, she would have to prove herself all over again in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Afghanistan would test everything she had learned, everything she believed about herself, and everything her crew had come to trust about her abilities. The real war was about to begin. The war Sarah had trained for was about to become brutally real. Afghanistan would strip away any remaining doubts about her capabilities, but it would also present challenges that no amount of training could fully prepare her for. The helicopter touched down at Forward Operating Base Chapman in the Coast Province of Afghanistan on a scorching August morning in 2010. As Sarah Chen stepped off the transport aircraft, she was immediately struck by the alien landscape. Barren mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, their jagged peaks looking like the broken teeth of some prehistoric beast. The air was thin and dusty, carrying the scent of diesel fuel, burning trash, and something else she couldn't identify but would later learn was the distinctive smell of a war zone. FOB Chapman was a sprawling collection of concrete barriers, prefabricated buildings, and aircraft hangars surrounded by razor wire and guard towers. It was home to several thousand American and coalition forces, all working to bring stability to one of the most volatile regions in Afghanistan. For Sarah and her crew, it would be their base of operations for the next 12 months. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment had been deployed to support Task Force 373, a classified Special Operations unit tasked with capturing or killing high-value Taliban and Al-Qaeda targets. Sarah's mission would be to insert small teams of Special Forces operators into remote villages and mountainous terrain, often under cover of darkness, and extract them safely after they completed their objectives. Captain Davidson briefed Sarah and the other pilots on the unique challenges they would face in Afghanistan. "The enemy here isn't like anything you've trained against," he warned. "They know this terrain better than we do. They've been fighting in these mountains for decades. They have experience with helicopters from the Soviet War, and they know how to use rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns effectively against aircraft." Sarah's first combat mission came just 3 days after arriving at Chapman. A Special Forces team had been tracking a Taliban commander in a remote village near the Pakistani border. Intelligence indicated that the target would be at a specific compound for only a few hours, and the team needed to move quickly to capture him before he disappeared back into the mountains. The mission briefing was held in a cramped room, filled with maps, satellite photos, and computer screens showing real-time intelligence feeds. Major Patricia Stevens, the mission commander, outlined the plan. Sarah would fly a 4-man Special Forces team to a landing zone about 2 kilometers from the target compound. The team would move on foot to the objective, capture or kill the Taliban commander, and then return to the landing zone for extraction. "The flight in should be routine," Stevens explained. "But the extraction could be hot. Intelligence suggests the target has between 15 and 20 fighters with him. If the team encounters resistance, they may need emergency extraction under fire." Sarah studied the terrain maps carefully. The landing zone was a small clearing surrounded by steep ridges and rocky outcroppings, perfect positions for enemy fighters to set up ambushes. The approach route would take her through a narrow valley where her helicopter would be vulnerable to ground fire from multiple directions. As they prepared for the mission, Sarah's crew chief, Williams, performed his pre-flight inspection with even more attention to detail than usual. "First combat mission," he explained to Sarah. "I want to make sure everything is perfect." Rodriguez checked and rechecked his door guns, ensuring that the ammunition was properly loaded and that his night vision equipment was functioning perfectly. Johnson ran through his emergency procedures checklist, rehearsing the actions he would take if the helicopter was hit by enemy fire. The mission launched at 0200 hours, with Sarah's Black Hawk flying in formation with another helicopter carrying a backup Special Forces team. They flew low and fast through the Afghan night, using night vision goggles to navigate through the mountainous terrain. The landscape below was completely dark. No electric lights, no roads, just endless rocky peaks and valleys dot as they approached the landing zone. Sarah's crew scanned the area for any signs of enemy activity. The green-tinted world visible through their night vision goggles revealed nothing but rocks and scrub brush. Sarah brought the helicopter down smoothly, and the Special Forces team was on the ground and moving toward their objective within seconds. Wait began. Sarah orbited the area at a safe distance, monitoring radio communications and staying ready to respond if the team needed emergency extraction. For 45 minutes, everything proceeded according to plan. The Special Forces team moved to the target compound, breached the doors, and began their search. Then the radio crackled to life. "We've got the target, but we're taking fire. Multiple fighters with automatic weapons. Request immediate extraction." Sarah's heart rate jumped, but her voice remained calm and professional. "Copy that. We're inbound to the landing zone now." As Sarah turned toward the extraction point, she could see muzzle flashes in the distance. The Special Forces team was in a running gun battle with Taliban fighters. Tracer rounds streaked through the darkness like deadly fireflies. "This is going to be a hot extraction," Rodriguez warned over the intercom. "I can see at least a dozen fighters moving toward the landing zone." Sarah pushed the helicopter to its maximum speed, racing toward the embattled Special Forces team. As they approached the landing zone, enemy fire erupted from multiple positions. Green tracer rounds whizzed past the helicopter, and Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of a K-47 bullets passing nearby. "Taking fire from 3 o'clock. Rodriguez shouted, returning fire with his door gun. Sarah threw the helicopter into a series of evasive maneuvers, using the terrain to mask her approach. She came in low and fast, flaring the helicopter at the last second to bleed off speed. The Special Forces team was running toward the landing zone, carrying their captured Taliban commander and dragging a wounded teammate. That ultimate test would come on a cold December morning that started like any other, but would end with Sarah facing the most impossible decision of her military career. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Black Hawk touched down in the landing zone with Taliban fighters less than 100 meters away. Sarah kept the engines running and the rotors turning while her crew provided covering fire. The Special Forces team loaded their prisoner and their wounded teammate in less than 20 seconds. But those 20 seconds felt like an eternity under enemy fire. "We're loaded, get us out of here," shouted the team leader over the radio. Sarah pulled up hard, climbing rapidly away from the landing zone. Behind them, muzzle flashes continued to light up the night as Taliban fighters fired at their departing helicopter. But they had made it. The mission was a success, and everyone was coming home alive. As they flew back to Fob Chapman, Sarah felt a mixture of adrenaline and pride. She had successfully completed her first combat mission, extracting a Special Forces team under enemy fire. Her crew had performed flawlessly, and the mission objectives had been achieved. But Sarah's celebration was short-lived. As they prepared to land at Chapman, Johnson noticed something troubling in the engine readings. "Ma'am, I'm seeing some unusual vibrations in the number 2 engine. Temperature is running a little hot." Sarah quickly scanned her instruments and confirmed Johnson's assessment. The engine was still functioning, but it was showing signs of stress. They landed safely at Chapman, but the post-flight inspection revealed shrapnel damage from enemy fire. Several small pieces of metal had penetrated the engine compartment, causing minor but potentially serious damage. "You got lucky," the maintenance chief told Sarah as they examined the damage. "A few inches to the left, and that shrapnel would have hit your fuel lines. A few inches to the right, and it would have severed your hydraulic lines. Either way, you probably wouldn't have made it home." This was Sarah's introduction to the reality of combat aviation in Afghanistan, where every mission was a roll of the dice, and survival often depended on inches and seconds. Over the next several months, these routine but dangerous missions would forge Sarah and her crew into an unbreakable team. They had no idea that all of this experience was preparing them for a mission that would test every skill they possessed and push them far beyond anything they thought possible. The missions began to blur together, inserting reconnaissance teams into remote mountain villages, extracting wounded soldiers from firefights, delivering supplies to isolated outposts, and supporting large-scale operations against Taliban strongholds. Sarah's skills as a pilot continued to develop, but more importantly, she began to understand the subtle dynamics of crew coordination under extreme stress. Rodriguez proved to be an exceptional door gunner, with an uncanny ability to spot threats and engage targets accurately while the helicopter was maneuvering violently. Williams became a master at improvising solutions to mechanical problems, often keeping damaged helicopters flying long enough to complete their missions and return to base. Johnson developed an almost supernatural ability to predict equipment failures, catching problems before they became critical, but it was Sarah's leadership that truly held the crew together. She had a talent for remaining calm under pressure, making quick decisions based on incomplete information, and inspiring confidence in her crew members even when the situation seemed hopeless. Her crew began to trust her completely, and that trust would prove crucial when they faced their ultimate challenge, the mission that would define Sarah's career. Began on a cold December morning in 2010. A Marine battalion had been conducting a large-scale operation in the Helmand province, searching for a Taliban weapons cache that intelligence sources claimed contained explosives and rocket-propelled grenades. The operation had been successful. The Marines had found and destroyed the weapons cache, but as they prepared to return to their base, they came under heavy attack. The Taliban had surrounded the Marines' position with over 200 fighters, including foreign jihadists with extensive combat experience. The Marines were outnumbered, outgunned, and running low on ammunition. Their only hope was helicopter extraction, but the landing zone was under constant enemy fire. Sarah's unit received the emergency call at 14:30 hours. "We have 47 Marines trapped in a hot landing zone," the operations officer briefed them. "Multiple enemy positions with RPGs and heavy machine guns. The Marines are taking casualties and need immediate extraction." Sarah's crew quickly prepared their helicopter for the mission. They loaded extra ammunition for the door guns, checked and rechecked all systems, and studied the terrain around the Marines' position. The landing zone was in a small valley surrounded by hills, perfect terrain for an ambush dot as they lifted off from Phobe Chapman. Sarah could see smoke rising from the battle area in the distance. The radio was filled with urgent communications from the Marines on the ground, their voices tight with stress and fear. Sarah knew that this mission would be unlike anything she had experienced before. "This is going to be rough," Rodriguez warned over the intercom. "I can see tracer fire from here, and we're still 10 miles out." Sarah's response was characteristic of her leadership style: calm, confident, and focused on the mission. "We've trained for this. We know what we're doing. Let's bring those Marines home." But as they approached the landing zone, Sarah realized that the situation was far worse than the initial briefing had indicated. The Marines weren't just under attack. They were completely surrounded and fighting for their lives. And what Sarah discovered next would force her to make a choice between following protocol and saving 47 American lives. The choice Sarah faced was brutal in its simplicity: abandon the Marines to certain death, or attempt a rescue that would almost certainly kill everyone aboard her helicopter. As Sarah's Black Hawk approached the besieged Marines' position, the scope of the disaster became clear. The valley floor was littered with burning vehicles and equipment. Smoke from explosions and fires created a hazy curtain that made visibility nearly impossible. Most ominously, the radio traffic from the Marines on the ground had taken on a desperate tone. "This is Bravo 6, came the voice of the Marine Battalion commander. "We have 15 wounded, including 3 urgent surgical cases. We need extraction now, or we're going to lose people." Sarah could see the Marines' position. From 2 miles away, a small cluster of vehicles and fighting positions surrounded by a much larger force of Taliban fighters. Muzzle flashes sparkled from dozens of positions in the surrounding hills, and the distinctive trails of rocket-propelled grenades streaked across the valley like deadly fireworks. "Jesus Christ," Williams muttered over the intercom. "There must be 200 fighters down there." Sarah's training kicked in. She began analyzing the tactical situation, looking for the best approach route and identifying potential threats. The landing zone was a small clearing about 100 meters from the Marines' defensive position. To reach it, she would have to fly directly through a gauntlet of enemy fire. "Rodriguez Johnson, I need you to identify every enemy position you can see," Sarah commanded. "Williams, check our defensive systems. We're going to take a lot of fire on this approach." As they moved closer to the landing zone, Sarah could see that the Taliban fighters had set up a sophisticated ambush. Heavy machine guns were positioned on the surrounding ridges, creating overlapping fields of fire that would make any helicopter approach extremely dangerous. Worse, she could see teams of fighters with rocket-propelled grenades moving into position to engage her helicopter. "This is a trap," Rodriguez observed grimly. "They're not just attacking the Marines, they're waiting for us." Sarah knew Rodriguez was right. The Taliban had learned from years of fighting against American helicopters. They knew that trapped ground forces would eventually call for helicopter extraction, and they had positioned their forces to destroy any aircraft that attempted a rescue. Sarah also knew that 47 Marines were counting on her to get them out alive. There was no question in her mind about what she had to do. "We're going in," she announced to her crew. "Williams, I want you to monitor all our systems. The second anything goes wrong, I need to know about it. Rodriguez Johnson, keep your eyes open for RPGs. They're going to try to knock us down." Sarah began her approach to the landing zone, flying low and fast to minimize her exposure to enemy fire. The helicopter bucked and weaved through the valley, using the terrain to mask her movement. Behind her, she could hear her crew members calling out threats and providing covering fire. "RPG team at 2 o'clock. Johnson shouted. Rodriguez immediately engaged the target with his door gun, sending a stream of tracer rounds toward the enemy. Position. The RPG team scattered, but Sarah could see more fighters moving into position. As they approached the landing zone, the volume of enemy fire increased dramatically. Bullets peppered the helicopter's fuselage, and Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of rounds impacting metal. Warning lights began flashing on her instrument panel. "We're taking hits," Williams reported. "Number 2 engine is showing elevated temperatures." Sarah continued her approach, fighting to control the helicopter as enemy fire damaged critical systems. She could see the Marines on the ground, waving frantically and carrying wounded comrades toward the landing zone. Then disaster struck. A rocket-propelled grenade detonated just off the helicopter's right side, sending shrapnel through the engine compartment and severing hydraulic lines. The helicopter lurched violently to the left, and Sarah felt the flight controls go slack. In her hands, "We've lost hydraulics." Johnson shouted over the intercom. Both systems are down. Sarah fought to regain control of the helicopter, using her remaining manual controls to keep them airborne. The Black Hawk was now flying on what pilots call Jesus strings, manual controls that require enormous physical strength to operate and provide only minimal control authority. "Can you still fly it?" Rodriguez asked, his voice tight with concern. Sarah's response was immediate and confident, despite the gravity of the situation. "I can fly anything with rotors. We're going to complete this mission." But as Sarah struggled to maintain control of the damaged helicopter, more systems began failing. The number 2 engine was overheating and losing power. The electrical system was shorting out, causing instruments to flicker and fail. Most critically, the hydraulic fluid that powered the flight controls was spraying across the cockpit like a red fountain. "Ma'am," William said quietly, "we need to get on the ground. Now this bird is coming apart." Sarah looked at the Marines below, some of whom were dragging wounded comrades toward the landing zone. She could see their faces, filled with hope and desperation. These men had been fighting for their lives for hours, and they were counting on her to save them. "We're not leaving without them," Sarah said firmly. "I don't care if this helicopter falls apart around us. We're getting those Marines out of here." But even as she spoke, Sarah knew that the situation was rapidly becoming impossible. The helicopter was barely controllable. Critical systems were failing, and they were still taking heavy enemy fire. In a few minutes, she would face the most difficult decision of her career, and the lives of 47 Marines would hang in the balance. What happened next would either be remembered as one of the greatest rescue missions in military history, or as a tragic reminder of the limits of human courage and mechanical endurance. Sarah made her choice. With a helicopter that was falling apart around her and 47 lives depending on her decision, she chose courage over caution, the impossible over the inevitable. With her helicopter rapidly disintegrating around her, Sarah Chen faced the most challenging flying situation of her career. The Black Hawk was losing power, losing hydraulics, and taking continuous enemy fire. Any rational pilot would have aborted the mission and attempted an emergency landing at the nearest safe area. But Sarah could see the Marines below, trapped and desperate, and she made a decision that would define her legacy. "We're going in," she announced over the intercom, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her. "Ma'am, are you sure about this?" Williams asked, his voice filled with concern as he watched hydraulic fluid spray across the cockpit windows. "Those Marines have been fighting for their lives for hours," Sarah replied, wrestling with the manual flight controls. "We're not abandoning them now. Rodriguez Johnson, I need you to lay down suppressive fire on those ridge positions. Williams, give me everything you've got on the engines." What Sarah was attempting had never been done before, landing a severely damaged helicopter in a contested landing zone while under heavy enemy fire. The Black Hawk's hydraulic-assisted controls were completely gone, meaning she had to physically muscle the helicopter through every maneuver. The collective control, which normally required just finger pressure to operate, now demanded her full arm strength. The cyclic stick, which controlled the helicopter's forward and sideways movement, felt like it was made of concrete. As Sarah began her final approach to the landing zone, she could see the Marines more clearly. They had formed a defensive perimeter around the landing zone, with wounded men lying on stretchers in the center. Several Marines were firing continuously at enemy positions, their ammunition running dangerously low. The scene below looked like something from a movie, except this was real, and people were dying. Taking heavy fire from the North Ridge, Rodriguez shouted over the intercom, his door gun chattering as he engaged multiple targets. Sarah could see the muzzle flashes from the ridge positions, and she knew that the Taliban fighters were concentrating their fire on her helicopter. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked past her cockpit, missing by less than 10 feet. The explosion behind them rocked the helicopter, but Sarah maintained her approach. "Number 2 engine is failing," Johnson reported, his voice tight with stress. "We're losing power fast." Sarah could feel the helicopter's performance degrading with each passing second. The rotor blades were struggling to generate enough lift to keep them airborne, and the engine that was still functioning was working at maximum capacity. She knew that she had maybe 60 seconds before the helicopter would be unable to maintain flight. "I can see the landing zone," Sarah called out. 30 seconds to touchdown. Get ready to load those Marines fast." As Sarah flared the helicopter to bleed off forward speed, a burst of machine gun fire stitched across the fuselage. She could hear the bullets impacting metal, and several warning lights flashed on her instrument panel. The helicopter shuddered and yawed to the left, but Sarah corrected with a violent input on the pedals. "We're almost there." She shouted over the noise of the engines and the incoming fire. "Everyone hold on." The landing was more of a controlled crash than a normal touchdown. With no hydraulic assistance, Sarah couldn't fine-tune her approach. The helicopter hit the ground hard, bouncing once before settling onto its landing gear. The impact was so severe that equipment broke loose inside the aircraft, and Sarah's crew was thrown against their restraints, but they were down. Against all odds, Sarah had successfully landed a critically damaged helicopter in a contested landing zone under heavy enemy fire. The Marines on the ground couldn't believe what they were seeing. Many of them had been certain that the helicopter would crash, killing everyone aboard and ending their chances of rescue. "Holy shit, they actually made it!" shouted a Marine corporal, his voice filled with amazement and relief. The Marine Battalion Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Barnes, immediately began organizing the loading of casualties. "Get the wounded on first," he ordered. "Urgent surgical cases go in the front of the aircraft." Sarah kept the engines running and the rotors turning while her crew helped load the wounded Marines. Rodriguez and Johnson had abandoned their weapons and were now acting as medics, helping to lift stretchers and wounded men into the helicopter. Williams was frantically trying to assess the damage to their aircraft while monitoring the failing engine. "We've got 18 wounded loaded," Barnes reported over the radio. "But we need space for 29 more Marines." Sarah quickly calculated the helicopter's weight and balance. A standard Black Hawk could carry about 11 fully equipped soldiers, but with the engine damage and the weight of the wounded Marines, they were already pushing the aircraft's limits. "We can take them," Sarah decided. "Load everyone you can fit." "Ma'am, we're way over maximum gross weight," Williams warned. "And with the engine damage, I don't know if we can get airborne." Sarah's response was immediate and confident. "We didn't come this far to leave anyone behind. Load them up." As the Marines continued loading casualties and personnel into the helicopter, Sarah noticed something troubling. The engine temperatures were climbing rapidly, and the remaining hydraulic system was showing signs of failure. She realized that, even if they managed to get airborne, they might not be able to stay in the air long enough to reach safety, but there was no time to worry about that now. The Taliban fighters were closing in on the landing zone, and several rocket-propelled grenades had landed dangerously close to the helicopter. Sarah knew that they had to leave immediately, or they would all die on the ground. The hardest part of their impossible mission was just beginning. Getting the helicopter airborne with twice its maximum load would require Sarah to push the laws of physics to their absolute breaking point. What Sarah accomplished next defied everything anyone thought they knew about the limits of aircraft. Performance and human determination. The Black Hawk was now carrying nearly twice its maximum recommended load. 47 Marines were crammed into every available space, some sitting on the floor, others hanging onto cargo hooks, and the most seriously wounded lying on stretchers that had been secured wherever they could fit. The helicopter's landing gear was compressed almost to its limits, and Sarah could feel the aircraft struggling under the enormous weight. "That's everyone." Lieutenant Colonel Barnes shouted over the noise of the engines. "All 47 Marines are aboard." Sarah began her takeoff sequence, knowing that what she was about to attempt was theoretically impossible. The helicopter was overloaded, critically damaged, and still taking enemy fire. The laws of aerodynamics suggested that they shouldn't be able to get airborne at all, much less fly to safety. "Rodriguez Johnson, I need you to tell me the instant." "You see an RPG team lining up on us," Sarah commanded. "Williams, give me everything the engines have left." Sarah pulled up on the collective control, demanding maximum power from the remaining engine. The helicopter shuddered and vibrated as the rotor blades struggled to generate enough lift. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. The aircraft remained firmly planted on the ground, its engines screaming at maximum power. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, the helicopter began to rise. Sarah could feel every pound of excess weight as the aircraft fought against gravity. The climb rate was agonizingly slow, barely 50 feet per minute when it should have been 10 times that fast. "We're airborne!" Rodriguez shouted, his voice filled with relief and amazement. But Sarah's relief was short-lived. As the helicopter climbed away from the landing zone, she could see Taliban fighters running toward their position from multiple directions, rocket-propelled. Grenades began streaking toward the slow-moving aircraft, and Sarah realized that they were presenting a perfect target. "RPG at 3 o'clock. Johnson warned Sarah through the overloaded helicopter into a desperate evasive maneuver, banking hard. To the left, the aircraft responded sluggishly, its flight controls heavy and unresponsive. The rocket-propelled grenade detonated just 50 feet behind them, close enough that the explosion rocked the helicopter and sent shrapnel through the tail boom. "We're hit again," Williams reported. "Tail rotor is showing vibrations." Sarah could feel the helicopter's handling becoming even more unstable. The tail rotor, which controlled the aircraft's yaw movement, was damaged and struggling to maintain proper function. Without a functioning tail rotor, the helicopter would spin out of control and crash. But Sarah had no choice but to continue flying. Below them, she could see muzzle flashes from dozens of enemy positions. The Taliban fighters were firing everything they had at the escaping helicopter: assault rifles, machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades. The aircraft was too heavy and too slow to effectively evade the ground fire, taking hits in the fuselage, Rodriguez reported, his voice tense as bullets impacted the aircraft around him. Sarah looked back at the Marines crammed into her helicopter. Many of them were wounded, some critically. Others were helping to hold pressure bandages on their injured comrades' wounds. All of them were looking at her with a mixture of hope and fear, trusting her to get them home alive. "How far to the nearest friendly base?" Sarah asked Williams. 23 miles to Fob Shank, Williams replied after checking his navigation equipment. "But ma'am, I don't think we can make it. The engine is overheating badly, and we're losing hydraulic pressure fast." Sarah knew that Williams was right. The helicopter was flying on borrowed time, and every system was pushed beyond its limits. The engine could fail at any moment, the hydraulics could give out completely, or the damaged tail rotor could disintegrate. Any of these failures would result in an immediate crash, but Sarah also knew that there were 47 Marines counting on her to get them to safety. She had already accomplished the impossible by getting the overloaded helicopter airborne from a contested landing zone. Now she had to find a way to keep them in the air long enough to reach friendly territory. "We're going to make it," she announced over the intercom, her voice filled with determination. "Williams, I need you to nurse that engine. Give me everything you can without blowing it up. Rodriguez Johnson, keep scanning for emergency landing sites. If we have to put down, I want options." As they flew through the Afghan night, Sarah continuously adjusted the helicopter's flight path to minimize stress on the failing systems. She flew lower than normal to reduce the load on the engine, but not so low that they would be vulnerable to small arms fire. She avoided aggressive maneuvers that might cause the damaged tail rotor to fail completely. Behind her, the Marines were doing everything they could to help. Some were applying pressure to hydraulic line leaks, trying to slow the loss of fluid. Others were monitoring engine temperatures and calling out readings to Williams. The critically wounded Marines were being cared for by their comrades, who were performing first aid with whatever medical supplies they had available. "Engine temperature is in the red zone," Williams reported grimly. "We're going to lose it soon." Sarah looked at her instruments and saw that Williams was right. The engine was running far hotter than it was designed to handle, and the temperature was still climbing. She knew that an engine failure was imminent, and when it happened, they would have perhaps 30 seconds of auto-rotation flight before they hit the ground. "How far to Fob Shank?" she asked. 12 miles, Williams replied. "Maybe 8 minutes of flight time." Sarah realized that they were in a race against time. The question was whether the helicopter would hold together long enough to reach safety, or whether they would crash in the Afghan wilderness with 47 Marines aboard. Every second that passed brought them closer to either salvation or catastrophe. And with every mile they flew, the odds of mechanical failure increased exponentially. The final minutes of their flight would determine whether Sarah's impossible gamble would result in the greatest rescue in military aviation history, or the most tragic crash. The Black Hawk limped through the Afghan night sky, its damaged systems failing one by one. Sarah Chen was flying an aircraft that should have been impossible to control, carrying a load that should have been impossible to lift, through conditions that should have been impossible to survive. Yet somehow, through sheer determination and extraordinary skill, she was keeping them airborne. "Engine temperature is critical," Williams reported, his voice tight with stress. "We're going to lose it any second now." Sarah could feel the helicopter's performance degrading with each passing minute. The engine was running so hot that she could smell burning oil and metal even through her flight helmet. The remaining hydraulic system was down to just a few gallons of fluid, and she knew that when it ran out, the flight controls would become completely manual. 6 miles to Fob Shank, Johnson reported from his position at the navigation console. "But I can see smoke coming from the engine compartment." Sarah looked back at the Marines packed into her helicopter. Many of them were wounded, some critically. One young Marine, who couldn't have been more than 19 years old, was unconscious and barely breathing. A Navy corpsman was performing CPR on him while other Marines held him steady against the helicopter's violent vibrations. "We're going to lose that kid if we don't get him to a surgeon soon," the corpsman shouted over the engine noise. Sarah knew that the critically wounded Marines would die if she couldn't get them to the field hospital at Fob Shank, but she also knew that her helicopter was rapidly approaching the point of catastrophic failure. She was facing an impossible choice: push the aircraft beyond its limits and risk killing everyone aboard, or attempt an emergency landing in hostile territory and condemn the wounded to death. "We're going to make it," Sarah announced over the intercom, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "Williams, I need 5 more minutes from that engine. Can you give me 5 more minutes?" Williams was frantically monitoring the engine instruments, trying to find some way to coax more performance from the failing power plant. "I can try reducing power slightly," he suggested. "Maybe that will bring the temperature down." Sarah knew that reducing power would cause them to lose altitude, but she also knew that an engine failure would be even worse. She carefully reduced the collective control, allowing the helicopter to descend slowly while maintaining forward airspeed. "We're losing altitude," Rodriguez observed, watching the ground creep closer through his night vision goggles. "I know," Sarah replied calmly, "but we're also reducing stress on the engine. We just need to make it a few more miles." As they flew lower, Sarah could see the lights of Fob Shank in the distance. The base's runway lights looked like a beacon of hope in the darkness, promising safety and medical care for the wounded Marines. But the helicopter was still several miles away, and the engine temperature was still climbing. "Temperature is pegging. The gauge," Williams reported. "We're going to lose it any second." Sarah could feel the helicopter's performance changing as the engine began to fail. The rotor blades were struggling to maintain proper RPM, and the aircraft was settling toward the ground despite her efforts to maintain altitude. She knew that they were entering the most dangerous phase of the flight. 3 miles to Shank. Johnson announced, "I can see the approach lights." Sarah began calculating approach angles and emergency procedures. If the engine failed completely, she would have to perform an auto-rotation landing, essentially a controlled crash where the helicopter's momentum keeps the rotor blades spinning long enough to cushion the impact. With 47 people aboard and a damaged tail rotor, the chances of surviving such a landing were minimal. "Ma'am," Williams said quietly, "I don't think we're going to make it." Sarah looked at her instruments and saw that Williams was right. The engine was running far beyond its design limits, and mechanical failure was imminent. But she also saw something else. The runway lights of FOB Shank were clearly visible ahead, and the base's emergency vehicles were already positioning themselves for their arrival. "We're going to make it," Sarah said firmly. "Rodriguez, Johnson, I need you to prepare the Marines for a hard landing. Williams, give me everything that engine has left." As they approached FOB Shank, Sarah could see fire trucks and ambulances racing to meet them. The base's emergency response team had been alerted to their situation and was preparing for a mass casualty event. Sarah knew that if she could just get the helicopter onto the ground, the wounded Marines would have a chance. 1 mile out, Johnson reported. "I can see the landing pad." Sarah lined up for her final approach, fighting to keep the helicopter under control as systems continued to fail around her. The engine was making terrible grinding noises, and she could see flames beginning to emerge from the engine compartment. The tail rotor was vibrating so violently that the entire aircraft was shaking. "We're on fire," Rodriguez shouted, pointing to the flames now visible outside the helicopter. Sarah knew that they had perhaps 30 seconds before the engine would fail completely, or the fire would spread to the fuel tanks. She pushed the helicopter toward the landing pad, trading altitude for airspeed in a desperate attempt to reach safety. "Hang on," she shouted to the Marines. "We're going in hard." The helicopter hit the landing pad with tremendous force, bouncing once before settling onto its landing gear. The impact was so severe that several Marines were thrown to the floor, but the aircraft remained intact. Sarah immediately shut down the engines and activated the fire suppression system, while her crew began helping the wounded Marines evacuate the aircraft. "We made it," Rodriguez shouted, his voice filled with amazement and relief. "We actually made it." But Sarah's work wasn't finished yet. She could see that several of the Marines were in critical condition and needed immediate medical attention. The fire in the engine compartment was spreading, and the helicopter would soon be consumed by flames. She had to get everyone off the aircraft before it was too late. What happened in those next crucial minutes would prove that Sarah's heroism extended far beyond her extraordinary flying skills. Even with the impossible flight completed, Sarah's true character would be revealed in how she handled the aftermath of the most remarkable rescue mission in modern military history. The moment the Black Hawk touched down at FOB Shank, Sarah Chen transformed from pilot to medic. Even as flames began consuming the engine compartment of her helicopter, she was helping to evacuate the wounded Marines, carrying stretchers and coordinating with the medical teams that were rushing to meet them. "Get the critical cases to the field hospital first," she shouted over the noise of approaching fire trucks and ambulances. "That Marine with the chest wound needs surgery now." The scene on the landing pad was chaotic but organized. Medical personnel swarmed the helicopter, triaging the wounded and rushing the most critical cases to the base's trauma center. Sarah's crew worked alongside them, helping to carry Marines who couldn't walk and providing first aid to those who were bleeding heavily. "Ma'am, you need to get away from the aircraft," a fire chief warned Sarah. "That engine fire is spreading, and we've got fuel everywhere." But Sarah refused to leave until every Marine was safely off the helicopter. She could see Rodriguez and Johnson still inside the aircraft, helping to move a Marine who had been unconscious during the flight. Williams was working to shut down the remaining systems and prevent the fire from spreading to the fuel tanks. "Come on, we've got to go." Sarah called to her crew. "The bird's about to blow." Rodriguez and Johnson emerged from the helicopter, carrying the unconscious Marine between them. Williams was the last to leave, having ensured that all the aircraft systems were shut down and the fire suppression system was activated. As they cleared the aircraft, a series of small explosions erupted from the engine compartment, sending flames and smoke high into the night sky. "Damn," Johnson muttered, watching their helicopter burn. "We're never going to fly that bird again." Sarah looked at the burning wreckage of the Black Hawk that had carried them through the impossible mission. The aircraft was completely destroyed, its airframe twisted and melted by the intense heat. But she felt no sadness at its loss, only pride in what they had accomplished. "It did its job," she said quietly. "It got us home." Over the next several hours, Sarah and her crew worked alongside the medical teams to help care for the wounded Marines. Many of the men they had rescued required emergency surgery, and several would spend weeks in the hospital recovering from their injuries. But they were alive, and that was what mattered. The young Marine who had been unconscious during the flight was one of the success stories. After emergency surgery to remove shrapnel from his chest, he made a full recovery and was eventually returned to duty. When he was finally able to speak, his first words were to ask about the pilot who had saved his life. "I want to thank the guy who flew us out of there," he told the Navy corpsman who had performed CPR on him during the flight. "He saved all of us." "Actually," the corpsman replied with a smile, "it was a she. And you'll get your chance to thank her." News of Sarah's heroic rescue spread quickly through the military community. The story of the young woman pilot who had landed a critically damaged helicopter in a contested landing zone, loaded it with nearly 50 Marines, and flown them to safety against impossible odds, captured the imagination of everyone who heard it. But Sarah was uncomfortable with the attention. When reporters tried to interview her, she deflected credit to her crew and the Marines who had fought so bravely on the ground. When military officials talked about recommending her for medals, she insisted that Rodriguez, Johnson, and Williams deserved equal recognition. "I didn't do this alone," she told her commanding officer. "My crew made it possible, and those Marines on the ground showed incredible courage." This was a team effort. The investigation into the mission revealed just how extraordinary Sarah's flying had been. Military aviation experts concluded that what she had accomplished was theoretically impossible. The helicopter had been damaged beyond what should have been flyable, loaded beyond what should have been possible, and operated in conditions that should have been fatal. "In 30 years of military aviation, I've never seen anything like it," said Colonel James Patterson, the investigation team leader. "Captain Chen didn't just save 47 Marines. She redefined what we think is possible in combat aviation." The formal recognition came several months later. Sarah was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the military's highest decoration for heroism in flight. Rodriguez, Johnson, and Williams received Bronze Stars for their actions during the mission. But for Sarah, the real recognition came from the Marines she had saved. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, the Marine Battalion commander who had been trapped in the valley, spoke at the award ceremony. "Captain Chen and her crew didn't just rescue us," he said. "They reminded us what it means to be warriors. They showed us that heroes don't quit, even when the situation seems impossible." The ceremony was attended by many of the Marines who had been on the helicopter that night. They formed an honor guard as Sarah received her medal, and their presence meant more to her than any official recognition ever could. After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by a group of young female cadets who had come to see her receive the award. They looked at her with admiration and hope, seeing in her an example of what was possible for women in military aviation. "Ma'am," one of the cadets asked, "what advice would you give to women who want to follow in your footsteps?" Sarah's answer was simple and direct. "Be so good at what you do that they can't ignore you. Train harder than everyone else. Study more than everyone else. And when the moment comes to prove yourself, don't hesitate. The people counting on you deserve your absolute best." The young women nodded, understanding that Sarah's path hadn't been easy, but seeing that it was possible. They left that day inspired to pursue their own dreams of military service, knowing that gender was no barrier to heroism. Years later, Sarah would look back on that night in Afghanistan as the defining moment of her career. Not because of the medals or recognition, but because of the 47 Marines who went home to their families. In a profession where success is measured in lives saved and missions completed, there could be no higher achievement. The helicopter that carried them to safety was destroyed, but the bonds forged that night would last forever. Sarah Chen had proved that heroes come in all forms, and that courage has no gender. She had shown that when everything seems impossible, the right person with the right training and the right heart can still make the impossible happen. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us,